Oh, welcome back to my seventh section of ownership lecture. This will be about business groups. The last section 6 was about families. Quite fascinating ownership category. But I would say that business group is quite fascinating, and it's interesting, especially for a Swede, because we have some distinct business groups that I would like to tell you a little bit more about. So this section will be maybe longer than the other ones, but I hope that it will be so interesting that you can listen it through. So, section 7, owner categories, business groups. I start with this slide because I use a citation. This presentation I'm doing here is based on an article that the theories was created on this article from '98. The title "Business Group Satisfying Governmental and Corporate Governance Needs." So I will present the ideas. I will present data here from the mid of 2010. I don't have actual data of the business group today, because I'm not doing any research about business groups today, and unfortunately not many others are doing it, so we can get good data. But the business groups are, like many other organizational forms in corporate governance, inert organizational forms. They change very slowly. So it's quite relevant of today. Business groups. I have a citation from Robertson. Here and there it's true, we have found islands of conscious power in the ocean of unconscious cooperation, like lumps of butter coagulating in a pail of buttermilk. That citation is used by Coase and Williamson when they are writing their theory about transaction costs, that is trying to answer the question, why do firms exist? Because if you are in economics, the only thing that you are doing is that you are talking about markets. Everything is a supply and demand, and there is a price in between. It's market. But when you open your eyes, you look around and you see, well, there is a dominant organization, except that there is the market, there is the government, but there is also the cooperative firm. So, and that is what Robertson are talking about, the islands of conscious power in this ocean of unconscious cooperation. Unconscious cooperation is the market. But then there is this conscious power, the hierarchy in this ocean of market. What's that? Well, that's the firm. So that's why I've done, trying to show it. Here is the market. This is the unconscious cooperation. And then you have the conscious cooperation. Those are the firms. But then those firms tend also to go together in lumps of butter. And those are the one that we call business groups. So business groups are a collection of corporations. And that is this section about. So if we define business groups, they consist of legally independent firms. It's not a concern where they are really dependent. It's a legally independent firms that are acting on their own. Probably many of them are listed on the stock exchange and having other owners. But they are joined together by some mechanism, some or several mechanisms. Very often it's equity ownership, so they have shares in each other, their own shares. And then distinctive with business group is that they are coordinating the use of one or more resources that is in the firm. I would say what is very common is that they are using resources of equity, of capital, and they're using resources of top managers. But this is the definition. And then I'm showing here the Wallenberg business group, and I would say, because you could say it, since I'm in Sweden, we're talking here about Sweden, you could say it's the Wallenberg country. the Wallenberg has been governing many of the huge Swedish corporations for many years. The Wallenberg country, the Wallenberg Business Group, it looks like a family business. It is really a family business because it started with Marcus and Knut in at the end of 1800 when they created the basis of the Wallenberg empire. It's the bank that is now what you call a Scandinavian bank. I don't know really the English name, but it started as the Stockholm Bank, Stockholm Enskilda Bank. There they organized first financial operations. Then they, in the crisis of the 20s, they turned many of these financing into ownership, and then they continue with ownership. They had sons and daughters, and two of them were then gaining the power. It was Marcus and Jacob. As you see, they are not so inventive on names. Then the third generation was Peter and one guy that had the name of Mark. He should be there, but he killed himself, suicide. So that's why there is only one person there. And then they continue with the tradition of having two boys as the representatives of the family. It's Marcus and Jacob. And as you can see, the innovativeness of names is not so high. And now we don't know who should be the fifth generation. Maybe it's time for a lady to show up. Maybe it's time for a boy to show up with the name of Sven. But they have this kind of strategy that they focus on two individuals that they invest their capacity in, that continues, that get the heritage of the family. But one thing that is very important to remember is that the Wallenberg Business Group, the individuals, they are rich, of course, but they do not belong to the 10 most wealthiest people in Sweden. So it's a very strange business group. It's extremely powerful. I will show you now. Here is 2007. That was the latest when I did this collection of description of the business group. Because we have two business groups. To the left, you see here is the Wallenberg Business Group. And to the right, we have another business group that is called Handelsbank Group. It's a group that is centered around one of the large Swedish banks, Svenska Handelsbanken. By the way, it's one of the most efficient banks in the world. And it's a management-controlled corporation. It's not a family control as the Wallenberg. In 2007, the center of both business groups, they are kind of imitating each other. So they look rather similar, although the Wallenberg Group is a family group and the Handelsbank Group is a management group. They have in the center investment corporations. The name is investor in the Wallenberg Group, and in the Handelsbank Group, the name is Industrivärden. And then they have, especially in Wallenberg Group, they have founded funds and foundations. One specific foundation that is connected to the ownership of investor and to other firms that really is the power base of the Wallenberg family. But these Handelsbank can also have funds and foundations. Here we can look at the corporations that they control is SKF, and ASEA was the name, but now it's ABB, AstraZeneca, Atlas Copco, Gambro, doesn't really exist anymore on the stock exchange. SE-Banken, so they have a bank that they control. They control also Saab, not the car factory, but they control also the car factory, but here is they are in defense production, and a big forest corporation. They also have Electrolux that they control. So these are huge, highly international, quite successful corporations from Sweden that are controlled by the Wallenberg Business Group. Then we have the Handelsbank Group. They control SCA in what is called wood and paper. They control the Volvo, that was the car and truck corporation by then. Skanska, SSAB, the steel corporation that I have a small part of. And then here they have Svenska Handelsbanken, the bank that is the basic of this business group. So they also have several highly international, quite competitive corporations that they control. So facts about Swedish business groups. Now I don't really remember when I got these numbers, but maybe it's the same today, rather same. If you look at the value of the Stockholm Stock Exchange, the Wallenberg Group control corporations that represent 35% of the value listed. The Handelsbank is less than half of this, it's 13%. It's not saying that they own 35% of the capital. They control corporations that represent 35%. So the Wallenberg family group is rather influential. Distinctive is that they have financial corporations, banks, foundations, investment corporations in the very center of the business group. And then surrounding this center are the industrial corporations. That's the organizational principle. When we look at the corporations, they are highly international. Not many, they have national corporations, but its distinctiveness is that they have international orientation. They are not, on average, they had a non-domestic sales of 78%, so they are extremely international. Characteristics of business group is that they have an internal managerial labor market. And that is not saying that in one corporation they have an internal managerial labor market, that they tend to recruit persons on the bottom and then they develop them through the hierarchy of the corporation. No, they can take one person from one corporation and put it in another corporation that belongs to the business group. So that is the internal managerial labor market, not the organization, but the business group as such. They have cross-ownership or they have foundations. Handelsbank Group had a power on cross-ownership. Cross-ownership is when one corporation owns shares in another corporation that owns shares in the first corporation. Or they could have foundations. There is a beautiful, the Wallenberg power base is a foundation. They have interlocking directorates. That means that one director sits at one board and then that director sits in another board in this business group. So that's kind of creating a flow of information between the corporations in the business group. Very distinctive is that you can see that they have political representation. When the government create a group that should discuss industry problems, you can find out that there is at least one representative of the Wallenberg Group and one representative of the Handelsbank Group. Specific for Swedish business group, but not for Japanese business group, is that there is no intra-trade. They don't have a tendency to trade between each other, except for one thing, and that is the financial resources. Because the distinctive thing is that they have this concept of the German house bank, a home bank. The bank, of course, they use many different banks, but they have a tendency to use one bank more than the other. That is the house bank. The Bank of the Casa. The origins of the groups is very similar. It started with Wallenberg and one guy that his name was Frenkel. Wallenberg created Stockholm Enskilda Bank, Frenkel created Svenska Handelsbanken. In fact, the story is like this, that there were managers in Stockholm Enskilda Bank that thought that the Wallenberg was assuming too much high risk. So they left the Stockholm Enskilda Bank and created a new bank. The name of the bank was Svenska Handelsbanken. So in fact, you can see that Wallenberg created their own business group and created the beginning of the other business group. And so then they have been continued imitating each other. In the 1910, they started with a lot of industry engagement They were engaged in supplying financing, especially debt, but also equity. That was possible then. There was a business boom. They made a lot of money. Then came the recession. It was total crash. Then there was a lot of shareholders that lost their ownership to the bank. So the bank assumed a lot of ownership into these corporations. It was you got the depression. It was really even more worse. Then came a legislation in Sweden that banks are not allowed to have shares. It's too risky for banks. So the banks took away the shares and put them in investment corporations. That's why you now see investor and industrivärden investment corporations that have these shares. These shares had the beginning from the bank. And then came the business boom when there was the Korean War in the 50s. And that created a huge Wallenberg group and a little bit smaller Handelsbank group. They have almost the same structure, they have almost the same history, and they have the same origin in Stockholm Enskilda Bank. That's what's happening in a small country like Sweden. Now, why do these business groups exist? I thought that I had a brilliant idea to create a theory trying to explain why do business groups exist, especially those in Sweden. Business group is, by the way, is not a specific Swedish case. Business groups exist in all countries, maybe except for the Anglo-American, UK and US and maybe Australia. They have been quite distinctive in Japan. They have been extremely successful in Germany. They exist as family business groups in Italy, as governmental groups in France. So I would say that business group is a more frequent way of organizing ownership than the totally dispersed ownership of the UK and US corporation. So this is not something exotic. This is something quite important in most economies. So I was thinking, why not try to explain it? So I tried to make an explanation that is focusing on the organizational level, very firm, or on the societal level in society. And I tried to distinguish between institutional efficiency, that they are well fitted to the environment where they are located, or governance efficiency. They have a way to govern that is efficient and therefore they will survive. So it's about survival. Why do they survive? The first one is focusing on power. The other one, societal level, is on isomorphism, that they have the capacity to adjust to isomorphic forces. On the governance is because of the corporate governance capacity to create economic efficiency or political efficiency. So let's run through these hypotheses. I will do it quickly because it's not so important to specify really the theory, but it's a way for me to tell the story about the business group. You could say institutional inertia. A business group exists because they have accumulated so many resources that they can survive independent of their degree of economic or political efficiency. I mean, they are so rich, so they can survive. There is one way that you could say, yeah, maybe that is true because they have a house bank. The house bank shields them from competition, gives them money. If they don't do any good, they get money from the house bank. That's really not the case. A house bank would never give money to less efficient corporations. What is against this institutional inertia idea that they survive because of their history is that they have had a tremendous growth. It's not only growth, but they grow through internationalization. When you are international, you cannot be a lazy bum. You have to be very competitive in order to survive in the international competition, because normally international competition is on a higher level than the competitive forces on the national level. So they are very efficient in surviving in this competition. At the same time, we have seen, but maybe now it's the end of it, a dramatic reduction of their family ownership during the last 30 years. And then, of course, we have the exception of Rausing Kamprad, Rausing, Tetra Pak, Kamprad, IKEA, Persson, H&M. But many other family ownership has disappeared. But the business group, they have been in business for more than 100 years. So I would say we can reject the idea that business groups exist because they are fat and rich. No, they appear to be competitive. Now one could say isomorphism, that they have a cultural fit. They fit into the society in which they are living. That's why they live. And now they live in the Swedish culture. So they fit very well into the Swedish culture of cooperation, modernism, and equality. So, what is the story of Sweden? Well, look at Sweden, 1500. Sweden was organized as a state 1521 by Gustav Vasa. So, at the beginning of 1500, Sweden was characterized by having a very small and extremely homogeneous population. It was characterized by having a very strong property-owning class, not of aristocracy, but of peasants. In the rest of Europe, the aristocracy were very strong. Remember in France, where they cut off their head at the end of 1700, the aristocracy were very strong. And even close to Sweden is a country called Denmark, and Denmark have a very strong aristocracy. You can see it if you go around in Denmark, if the West Denmark or it's the East Denmark, where I live in Scania, which nowadays is the south of Sweden, you see many, many castles, which is an indication of a strong aristocracy. If you go up in Sweden, well, you are lucky if you find a castle. Well, there's one castle in Stockholm, which indicates the presence of a king. That is characteristic of Sweden. You have a king, and you don't have an aristocracy, but you have a strong peasant class. So, weak aristocracy, and then a strong state, a very strong state. Now go to the 1900, and I would say before 1980, because then there have been major changes in Swedish society. But before that, you still had a small and homogeneous population. Today that is not correct because we have had an inflow of immigrants and refugees. So now it's a more diverse population. But until that happened, that was starting at the middle of 80s. So before that, extremely small homogeneous population. You said that everyone in Sweden was a social democrat, even if you voted right wing. You went to the cooperative in order to buy your food, and you drank a bottle of spirits on Friday and got really drunk and had a headache on Saturday. Everyone was doing the same. You had a very strong labor movement and a very strong social democratic party. The aristocracy, still very weak, but the state gained in power and was very strong until the middle of the 80s. So a very homogeneous, very strong society. And then it's characterized by cooperation, and that was called corporativism. That is when you have a tight cooperation between the state, the labor movement, and the private capital. Those three are very interconnected. They are not really fighting each other. Well, they fight, they have negotiations, but they're very close. That is the characteristics of cooperation. If you have a problem, you cooperate, you don't fight. That has been the tradition of Swedes. And then that is also based then on consensus. In Sweden, you don't hear people scream and shout as in the south of Europe, and that is because we don't discuss with a loud voice, and we don't discuss really with a lot of conflict. We try to find out consensus, which sometimes is that you accept what other people are saying. You don't like it, but you accept it because consensus is more important than to have your will implemented. Consensus means also that you get flat organizations, very flat organization, because everyone is thinking all the same. So you don't need these hierarchical organizations that exist in England, UK, US. There are very small differences between the worker and the boss. I can tell you some stories about this flat organization. A person very close to me went, really Swede, went to London in order to work at Benetton, an Italian corporation run by Italians and by Englishmen. And she got very irritated because she found out that there was a huge hierarchy in a small shop. There was a manager, there was the workers, and then there were managers, and then there were managers of the managers, and then there were managers of the managers of the managers. So there was a huge hierarchical, many levels of hierarchy in a shop. Just amazing. And then she did what she's assumed to do. She did the work. And as a Swedish worker, you know what to do, and you do it. You are not standing just thinking, oh, I'm waiting for an order. No, you are acting. But that is not really correct to do in a hierarchical organization. You have to stand there and wait for an order. And when you get the order, you have to do it. You don't discuss it. In Sweden, if someone tells you, do this, then you start discussing, saying, maybe not, maybe this is better. So it's a more creative, and you discuss because there is no difference between you and the boss. The boss is, well, yes, you are a boss, but yeah, maybe if we cannot find a solution on our discussion, maybe then we have to do it your way, but we discuss it. That is not the case in UK. If the boss says you should jump on your leg, then you jump on your leg. And then when you have done it, you stop doing it. And then you wait for the next thing. So it's a kind of, they have a high level of obeying, but they are quite passive. In Sweden, you don't obey and you are active. So that created a kind of tension. But that is because since we are similar, we don't need to have an order. We know what to do. We have this kind of equality, the idea of equality that no one is different from anyone else. There is a famous story told by Hofstede in one of his books. The story is about the Swedish king that went shopping presents for Christmas to his children, and he got the presents, and then he came to the where you should pay, and then he handed over a credit card, because that was, even then you used the credit card, but then you didn't have these machines to put on the code. You had always to present your credit card and your ID. And the king was looking around and, oh, I forgot my driving license. I don't have an ID. And the one that is on the accepting the payment said that you have to show your identity. You have to confirm your identity. And the king in Sweden, you don't claim that I am the king. He tried to find it, but then there was another person in the queue that said, maybe here I have a solution. So he took a coin, a Swedish coin, 1 krona, and on that coin is the face of the king. And he said, can you see? That's the same. The king in here on the krona, and it's the same. Could that be an identity card? The guy said, no, we have to do it the ordinary way. So you have to fill in a form. That is what is needed if you don't have an identity card. So the King of Sweden, he is the highest formally in Sweden, had to fill in a form in order to be able to pay for his presents. That is equality. There is no difference. I have to show my identity card and fill in the form. The king has to do the same. No difference. So that is the equality. So when you have this kind of culture, consensus and equality, but that should create the idea of one single large cooperative group when everyone is cooperating. But that is not happening. In Sweden, you have 2 business groups and they are really competing. So there's a competition between the groups. And then if you have consensus equality, maybe you should expect randomly structured groups, not this very specific structure. But they are structured with financial industrial corporations, financial in the center, industrial outside. So I think that we can react the cultural fit. We don't have business group because of the Swedish culture. And of course that is true because when you look around, you have business groups in cultures that are quite different from Swedish culture, like Italy, for example. Then you can have the economic efficiency. This is a more lengthy explanation. You can read the slides yourself and then find out, because I try to convince you that there is an economic efficiency because there is a limited supply of credit managers in Sweden. So if you can get your hands on credit, if you can get your hands on good managers, you try to enclose them, you try to keep them. That's why you have an internal managerial labor market in the business group. If you find some good, you keep them. You have the house bank. The house bank means that you have a high level of trust between corporations and the bank, so it's easier to deal with the debt. So I would say that I can find some case that business group create economic efficiency through internal managerial labor market, through trust. And then you have this rotation between the group, within the group, but not between the group. So that is also an indication. Then I can tell you one more story about the internal managerial labor market. There was one guy in the management, in the top level of the business group of Wallenberg. He was walking out in the park outside the bank when he met the boss of the other business group. And that boss of the other business group said to this top manager, would you like to work in my bank? And this guy said, no, I'm fine in Wallenberg Group. Okay. And then this guy went back, that belonged to the Wallenberg Group. He went back, went into the bank. He met the partner of the Wallenberg Group, Marcus Wallenberg, and he said, I just got an offer to work in Handelsbank, the other business group. And then Marcus Wallenberg said, you have 5 minutes to pack your things and get out. You are fired. And Marcus Wallenberg said his argument for this very dramatic firing was that if you tell this story, you have a small, not a percentage, but a small, maybe small half percentage of idea that it could be a possibility. It means that you are not 100% loyal. You are 99.999 loyal, but not 100%. I don't want people that are not 100% loyal. So that is an indication of a very strong internal managerial labor market. So don't react this. I think business group exists because of economic efficiency. Then look at political efficiency. I claim that they offer governmental manageriality of all these corporations through a small number of actors involved, actors that can influence the corporations to a very large extent. Imagine in Sweden, by then, if you wanted something to be done, if you are the prime minister, you phone maybe the king for formal reasons, but no, it's not necessary. But you need the prime minister, you need the top of the Wallenberg Group, the top of the Handelsbank Group. You need these 3 people, and then you need the labor union representative. So 4 people, that's it. Then you can do many things. So that is creating manageability in the economy. So the business groups, they offer development of large-scale corporations, creating employment in the country and huge export revenues. That's very nice. That's very good. So that's why the politicians like business groups. And then they offer governance capability, the corporativism, that you don't have many capitalists that you need to discuss with and coordinate with. Only a few you need in order to succeed. So I think that you cannot reject the political explanation. So it's because of economic governance and political reasons that business groups exist. So why don't we have a single group, one single business group of the politicians? If they would like to have small talk with few people, then one group is less than 2 groups. And it's quite possible. The Swedish politicians could destroy 1 or 2 of these business groups. They could say, we want 1 share, 1 vote. That would destroy especially Handelsbank Group. You can have a ban on cross ownership. In Handelsbanken they have cross ownership, so that would destroy Handelsbanken. You can forbid funds to exercise voting rights. That would especially destroy the Wallenberg Group. No problem. Why should funds have voting rights? You could restrict the amount of shares that investment corporation could own in single corporations. That is both industry värden and investor. Both investment corporation would lose their power. So it's so easy to destroy the business group. If they don't like it, poof. But one group, that means that you run the risk of hold-up, because then one group, you have to meet one group. You cannot play with two groups and they compete with each other. You have only one, and then they can say to the politicians, well, if you don't like it, we move. And then politicians cannot say anything, so it's a hold-up. And then you have the monopoly idea. If you have one group that is totally dominant in monopoly, you always tend to have slack. So it's not good for efficiency. So then you have two, maybe a few more groups, then you have efficiency and you get this governmental ability. So that's why I think that the politicians, they like, even if they don't like power concentration, they like to have it so they can govern the industry, the economy. So, to sum up, the owner of business, when we talk about business groups, the competence and information about the firm is extremely high. They know about the corporation because they have been running this corporation for 100 years. The competence is firm specific, but they also have this general competence within the banks. Transferability, it's moderate or even low. Moderate, sometimes they disinvest, they leave one corporation, but certain corporations, they always keep. For example, in the Wallenberg Group, you cannot imagine the idea that they are selling Atlas Copco. That is a basic foundation of the Wallenberg Group. The investment in networks are very high, and the business elite is very high because maybe you could say that these business groups constitute the core of the business elite. The investments they do is quite high, but not so high as families, for example, because they are more focused on getting so much investment that they get control, but they don't need to invest more. The diversification capacity is, of course, very high. The very business group as such is a diversified organization. Risk preferences, I put here high. There is a difference. Wallenberg tend to be a little bit higher on the risk than the Handelsbank Group when you look at the corporations. Liquidity preferences, well, they have some liquidity preferences because they have loans in order to finance their activities, so it's moderate. So the governance strategy is extremely active. It's like in the family, but they don't engage so much in gaining all this management position, although they are creating an internal managerial labor market. So it's a very high, they score very high on activity. And like family firms, they appear to be rather efficient because they can have survived now for 120 years, you could say. Both Wallenberg and Handelsbank Group has survived with certain specifics. So that was the end of my three sections of different owner characteristics. Now it's time to summarize.